If you're an emerging author, then becoming a New York Times bestselling author might be one of your biggest dreams. But do you really understand how the bestseller list gets put together? How does a book make it onto the New York Times bestseller list? Today, I want to talk about the truth behind how a book makes it onto the list and gains this revered status. I used to work in the publishing industry at Penguin Random House and a leading literary agency, and in both cases, we regularly worked our tails off to ensure that the books that we were publishing made it onto the list. It was constantly something that we were striving for. Because there is a certain prestige associated with the New York Times bestseller list, and it can help create more sales if a book reaches the status. Now, there was a really interesting article published last month in Esquire that did a deep dive into how the list gets made and used various publishing industry sources to try to crack the code of what the New York Times bestseller list is and how they calculate their rankings. So today I want to go through the top insights that I gleaned from this article and give you some color for how I saw this play out when I worked in the industry. There were a lot of really interesting secrets that I did not know before about the New York Times bestseller list. So I hope this helps you understand this highly public element of the publishing industry that actually a lot of us know very little about. If you are interested at all in the book publishing industry, I recommend subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. Every week, I either post videos with insider insight into the industry, like today's video, or I talk about how to strengthen your book if you have a current work in progress. I also have a free resource in the description below if you are working on a book. It is called my free story self-assessment, and it is a short worksheet that's going to help you determine what's working really well in your draft and what could be improved on the next draft to take it to the next level. It's also going to sign you up for my newsletter, where I interview publishing industry experts and published authors, so you don't want to miss out on all of that great insight. If you want to go straight to the newsletter, there's also a link to that in the description. So first, for anyone who is not as familiar with the New York Times bestseller list, I want to just give a brief overview of what the list is and what categories it includes. The New York Times bestseller list, often referred to as just the list in publishing, is divided into sections based on the genre of the book and the format of the book. Remember that traditional publishers typically publish every title in 3 formats: ebook, hardcover, and paperback. The sales figures that the New York Times collects to inform its list are aggregated on a weekly basis, Sunday to Sunday. So every week, there will be a published list that will be new and updated based on the previous week's sales. So the different format categories for the list are combined print and ebook, so all of the sales for the book essentially. Then there is a hardcover list specifically and a paperback list specifically. The list is actually a conglomerate of different sets of lists based on genre. So those genres are fiction, nonfiction, advice, how-to, and miscellaneous, that's all one genre, children's middle grade, children's picture books, children's series, and young adult. Those are all of the weekly lists, again divided into the format categories that I discussed. Then there are monthly lists for the following genres: audiobooks, business, graphic/manga, mass market, middle grade paperback, and YA paperback. So the New York Times bestseller list does not include every single book published out there. If it falls outside of those genres I just listed, it's not going to be included in the books that are considered for the list. But it covers a wide range of books, certainly most of the books that you will see when you walk into a bookstore. So now let's get into the juicy stuff, right? What are these dirty secrets behind the New York Times bestseller list? Well, the first one is that no one knows how it gets calculated. The New York Times does not publish how they calculate their list. They do not publish what sources they use for their data, and this frankly baffles a lot of people in the publishing industry because it is very hard to figure out why certain books are on the list and others are not. And it has led to a lot of speculation, which I will get into. So let me read you the official New York Times statement on how the list is created. Rankings reflect unit sales reported on a confidential basis by vendors offering a wide range of general interest titles published in the United States. Every week, thousands of diverse selling locations report their actual sales on hundreds of thousands of individual titles. The panel of reporting retailers is comprehensive and reflects sales in tens of thousands of stores of all sizes and demographics across the United States. So essentially what I at least take away from this statement is that they're saying the list is composed of a bunch of sources that include reports of sales from many different retailers, and they're claiming that this is more or less accurately reflecting book sales in the United States. But this statement really stops short of disclosing what specific sources they use to calculate the book sales that determine the rankings, which is frustrating, but is also presumably because they don't want people or organizations buying in bulk from those specific retailers to try to skew the list. So a really interesting piece to the New York Times bestseller list mystery is that it does not align oftentimes with the data published in the publishing industry's primary data source, which is called BookScan. This is a database I used and referenced frequently when I was in the industry, and it is pretty much what we used as the source of truth, more or less, for how many units a book sold across its various formats. But if you check the New York Times bestseller list against BookScan, there are discrepancies. For instance, a book might be higher on BookScan, but then lower on the New York Times list. So that's why people in the industry see that it is not perfectly aligning and are wondering how the New York Times list is getting its numbers, basically. There has to be some other source of data or some different way of slicing the data. It's truly a mystery. The next secret about the New York Times list that was revealed in this article is that suspicious sales activities are flagged by the New York Times. So one of the biggest theories about the New York Times bestseller list and potentially why certain data points are not aligning with other industry databases is because some professionals in the industry believe that the New York Times bestseller list prioritizes books that are sold at indie retailers over, say, mass retailers or online retailers, because they think that the sales at indie retailers are better representing actual reader purchases. The list does try actively to eliminate any outlier sales, such as huge bulk purchases, because that could be someone trying to game the list and get their way on it when those aren't genuine sales, which again, I will get into in a little bit. So if you look at the list itself, any title that actually has some potential suspicious activity is flagged with a dagger symbol. So if you've seen that symbol on the list and didn't know what it means, that's what it means. Somewhere in their calculations, they did see an outlier sale of some kind, probably a large bulk purchase, and they still included the title in the list, but they put the dagger on there so you know, there might be something funky going on with the sales numbers. The official New York Times statement about the dagger is this: institutional special interest group or bulk purchases, if and when they are included, are at the discretion of the New York Times bestseller list desk editors. When included, such bulk purchases appear with a dagger. The next piece of insight about the New York Times bestseller list I want to talk about is that pre-order and week one sales are critical. The holy grail in the publishing industry is for a book to debut on the New York Times bestseller list in its first week of publication. The reason being because it helps with the book launch momentum and can create a snowball effect that then generates more sales. But how does this actually happen? To do this, publishers and authors work tirelessly to rack up pre-orders in the weeks and months leading up to publication, because for the purposes of the New York Times bestseller list, any purchases that are made of the book before the publication date, what we call pre-orders, are included in the week one sales. So because you have all those extra months and weeks to lead up to the sale, they try to get as many pre-orders as they can, because then the week one sales are going to be inflated. This is why you will see many authors and even publishers themselves on social media promoting the book in the weeks leading up to the launch and mentioning that they can be pre-ordered. This is also why authors will often do speaking engagements or media appearances leading up to the publication, because that can help them rack up more pre-orders. The issue with the pre-order / week one sales phenomenon is that a book will often debut on the New York Times bestseller list, then immediately fall off, right? Because that momentum is not sustained because so many of those sales were actually pre-orders, and it doesn't mirror the week-by-week sales numbers, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the publisher and the author accomplished the task of becoming a New York Times bestseller, right? But it can be disappointing to then immediately fall off the list. And it can be confusing for consumers who see a book on the list and then never see it again. My last little secret that I learned about the New York Times bestseller list that was truly news to me is that some people pay their way to getting on the list. There are agencies out there where an author will pay them a certain sum that covers a certain number of copies of the book. So essentially, they will pay them equal to, or maybe a little bit more than, 100 hardcover copies. And then the agency will take the money and promise to make it look like those books were all purchased organically. So maybe they scatter them at different retailers rather than doing that bulk purchase issue. Or authors will simply ask their friends to go buy out all of the copies of their book in their local bookstores and then pay them back for them. According to the Esquire article, these tactics most often happen with authors of nonfiction, specifically business and self-help authors, because in those cases, it might be very important to the author to have the New York Times bestseller label for their brand. But remember, if you go the traditional publishing route and you have a dedicated marketing and publicity team, they are absolutely not going to condone you doing this. And certainly no one at the publishing house is going to go through these back alleys to try to manipulate the book sales to get a book on the list. I hope this video helped illuminate some of the background to the New York Times bestseller list and some of the secrets to how it gets made. It's one of the most mysterious aspects, yet one of the most prominent aspects of the book publishing industry. So it's really interesting for me personally to explore, and I hope you found it interesting as well. I want to reiterate that your success and value as an author absolutely does not correlate to whether or not you make it on the New York Times bestseller list or any bestseller list for that matter. So while of course it can be a goal and maybe something that motivates you, I really don't want you to get down or feel discouraged if you haven't reached that status or you don't reach that status in the time that you want to. Let me know in the comments what other questions you have about some mysterious aspects of the publishing industry or Big Five publishing houses in general. I would love to see if I can talk about any of them in a future video. If you are looking for some more insight into the publishing industry, I have another video about little known secrets about traditional publishing, so definitely check that one out. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget the free story self-assessment resource and my newsletter link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.